Everyone believed Kanye West was a genius. Not just talented, not just successful, but a once-in-a-generation mind who could see what others couldn't. He didn't follow trends. He created them. From music to fashion, from culture to influence, Kanye wasn't just part of the industry, he was shaping it. And for a long time, everything seemed to prove that belief right. The awards, the sold-out albums, the global recognition. It looked like the perfect story of a man who had complete control over his vision, his image, and his future. But that was only what people saw. Because behind the success, something else was building. Something slower, something harder to notice. First, it didn't look like a problem. Just confidence, just boldness, just someone who refused to be like everyone else. But over time, that confidence started to feel different. The interviews became more unpredictable. The statements became harder to explain. And the line between genius and chaos started to blur. People didn't know exactly when it changed. There wasn't a single moment where everything broke. Instead, it happened gradually. So gradually that most people didn't even realize it was happening. Until one day, it was impossible to ignore. Because the same person who once controlled the culture now seemed unable to control himself. And what happened next didn't just change his career. It changed how the world saw him forever. And what happened next? Before Kanye West became one of the most recognizable figures in the world, he was known for something much simpler. He was a producer, not the face of the music, not the voice people followed, just the person behind the sound. But even in that role, there was already something different about him. While many producers stayed in the background, Kanye didn't want to disappear behind the music. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be heard. And more importantly, he believed he deserved it. That belief was clear long before the world agreed with him. In the early 2000s, Kanye began working with some of the biggest names in hip-hop. His production style stood out immediately. It was soulful, emotional, and layered in a way that felt different from everything else at the time. It wasn't just music. It felt intentional. And that intention started to get attention. But there was a problem. The industry didn't see him as an artist. No matter how talented he was, no matter how much he believed in himself, record labels didn't take him seriously as a rapper. To them, he was valuable, but only in one role, behind the scenes. For most people, that would have been the end of it. But Kanye wasn't most people. Instead of accepting that limitation, he pushed against it. Constantly, publicly, relentlessly, and eventually he got his chance. When his debut album, The College Dropout, was released, it didn't just perform well. It changed the conversation. This wasn't the typical image of a rapper at the time. He wasn't presenting himself as untouchable or invincible. He was vulnerable, self-aware, different, and people connected with that. The success was immediate, and more importantly, it was validating. Everything Kanye had believed about himself suddenly felt real. But even in that moment, there were signs that something deeper was forming. Because the success didn't make him more grounded. It made him more certain. With each album that followed, the scale grew larger. Late registration, graduation. Each project expanded his influence. Each release pushed him further into the center of the culture. And with that influence came something else. Control. Not just over his music, but over how he was seen, how he was talked about, and how he positioned himself in the industry. He wasn't just participating anymore. He was directing. But control has a way of changing people. First, it looks like confidence. Then it becomes certainty. And eventually, it starts to look like something else. Because the more success Kanye achieved, the less he seemed willing to be questioned. The less he seemed willing to slow down. And the more he began to blur the line between who he was and who he believed he had to be. At the time, none of it felt like a warning. It just looked like ambition. But looking back, this was the moment where everything started to shift. Because the rise wasn't just building his career. It was building the pressure that would eventually break it. First, nothing seemed out of place. Kanye West was still winning. Still releasing music that pushed boundaries. still being praised as one of the most creative forces in the industry. From the outside, the rise hadn't stopped. If anything, it had accelerated. But the way people talked about him was starting to change. Not all at once. Not in a way that felt obvious. Just small moments, small reactions, small questions that didn't fully form yet. It began with how he carried himself in public. The confidence that once felt inspiring started to feel unpredictable. The certainty that once felt earned began to sound absolute. And slowly, the space between what he said and how people understood it started to grow. There were interviews where his answers didn't follow a clear path. Statements that felt unfinished or too direct or impossible to interpret. At first, people dismissed it. That's just Kanye. That's how he's always been. But that explanation didn't hold for long, because the moments kept happening. And each time they felt slightly different than before. Slightly more intense. Slightly more difficult to ignore. Then came the public incidents. Moments that couldn't be edited, couldn't be reframed, couldn't be explained away after the fact. Moments that forced people to stop and look more closely. What used to be seen as boldness now started to look like unpredictability. What used to be confidence now started to feel like something harder to define. And yet, at the same time, his influence hadn't disappeared. If anything, it made everything more complicated. Because he was still creating, still shaping culture, still proving, in many ways, that his talent hadn't gone anywhere. That contradiction made it harder to understand what was really happening. Was this just part of his personality? Or was something changing? There wasn't a clear answer. Only more moments, more headlines, more reactions. And with each one, the distance between his public image and public perception continued to widen. But the real shift wasn't just in how people saw him. It was in how quickly things were escalating. What used to take years was now happening in months. What used to feel isolated was now starting to feel connected, like pieces of a pattern that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. And even then, most people didn't think it would lead anywhere serious. They had seen controversial moments before. They had seen celebrities recover. There was always a reset. But this time felt different. Not because of one event, but because of how often they were happening, and how little space there was in between. It was no longer a question of whether something was off. It was a question of how far it would go. And no one had an answer yet, because the moment that would define everything hadn't happened. Not yet, but it was getting closer. And when it finally arrived, there would be no way to ignore it. By the time the shift became impossible to ignore, it didn't feel sudden. It felt inevitable. Looking back, there wasn't a single moment that caused everything to collapse. There was a build-up, pattern, a series of events that kept pushing further each time. But then, there were moments that changed everything. Moments that didn't just create headlines, but rewrote how people understood him. One of the earliest turning points came on a stage where he wasn't supposed to be the focus. During the 2009 MTV Video Music Awards, in a moment that lasted only a few seconds, Kanye West walked on stage and interrupted Taylor Swift. At the time, it felt chaotic, disrespectful, unpredictable. But more than that, it was confusing, because it didn't fit the image people had built of him. Or maybe, it revealed something they hadn't fully seen before. The reaction was immediate. Public backlash, media coverage, a moment that replayed over and over again. For many, this was the first time the line between confidence and something else started to break. But it didn't stop there. Years later, the intensity returned. Only this time, it was more personal, more exposed. In 2016, during the St. Pablo tour, everything began to unravel in real time. Concerts became unpredictable. Rants replaced performances. And the audience wasn't sure what they were watching anymore. It no longer felt like an artist pushing boundaries. It felt like someone losing control in front of millions of people. And then suddenly the tour ended. Not with a final show. Not with closure. Just silence. Shortly after, Kanye West was hospitalized. At that moment, the narrative shifted completely. This was no longer just controversy. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be explained as personality or ego or artistic expression. For the first time, people began to question not just what he was doing, but what he was going through. But even after that, the story didn't stabilize. It escalated. The following years brought a different kind of attention. Not through music, not through art, but through statements, appearances, alignments that shocked even those who had followed him for years. Public support for political figures. Comments that felt disconnected from reality. Moments that sparked outrage on a global scale. Each one more difficult to contextualize than the last. And with every new incident, something important was happening. The gap between who Kanye West was and how the world saw him was no longer widening. It had split completely. Some people still saw the genius. Others saw something they couldn't support anymore. And there was no middle ground left. The artist who once controlled culture was now at the center of a different kind of attention. One defined by controversy, confusion, and division. And in that space, everything he had built started to feel unstable. Because fame had once amplified his voice. Now, it was amplifying everything else. And what came after this point wasn't about a single mistake. It was about the consequences of everything that had been building for years. After the breaking point, the story didn't slow down. It changed direction. The attention was still there. The headlines were still constant. But the tone was different. Before, people were trying to understand him. Now, they were reacting to him. And that shift mattered. Because once public perception changes, it doesn't just affect how people see you. It affects what opportunities remain and which ones disappear. For years, Kanye West had built more than a music career. He had built influence. In fashion, in business, in culture. His brand extended far beyond albums and performances. And for a long time, that influence seemed untouchable. But after the controversies escalated, that stability began to break. Partnerships that once defined his success started to fall apart. Companies distanced themselves. Collaborations were paused or ended entirely. Business relationships that took years to build disappeared in a matter of days. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate. And it was public. For the first time, the consequences of his actions were happening at the same scale as his fame. Not behind the scenes. Not quietly. But in a way that everyone could see. And that visibility changed everything. Because the story was no longer just about what he said or did. It was about what it cost him. At the same time, the public reaction became more divided than ever. Some people saw this as accountability. A long overdue response to behavior that had gone too far. Others saw something different. They saw a person who had lost control of his narrative. A person who was being judged without understanding the full picture. That division didn't resolve anything. It deepened the confusion, because there was no longer a single version of Kanye West. There were multiple interpretations existing at the same time. The genius, the controversial figure, the artist, the problem, and depending on who you asked, each version felt real. But what made the aftermath different from everything before was the sense of finality. Earlier controversies always felt temporary, something he could recover from. Something that would fade over time. This didn't feel like that. This felt permanent. Because the damage wasn't just to his image. It was to the structure around him. The systems that supported his career. The relationships that amplified his work. And once those are gone, they're not easily rebuilt. Yet even in that moment, something unusual remained. Tension. People were still watching. Still talking. Still trying to understand what would happen next, which created another contradiction. Because even as things were falling apart, he was still impossible to ignore, and that raised a question that no one could answer yet. Was this the end of his influence, or just another transformation? Because if his story had shown anything up to this point, it was that nothing about it followed a predictable path. And what came next would challenge that idea even further. In the end, Kanye West didn't disappear. That might be the most unexpected part of the entire story. After everything that happened, the controversies, the backlash, the loss of partnerships, there was an assumption that his influence would fade, that the attention would move on, that the industry would replace him, that the story would quietly come to an end. But it didn't, because even without the same level of support, even without the same structure around him, Kanye West remained visible. People still talked about him, still reacted to him, still tried to understand him. And that's where the paradox becomes impossible to ignore. The same fame that helped build his success also made it impossible for him to step away from it. Every moment was amplified. Every statement carried further. Every action reached more people than it normally would. Fame didn't just give him a platform. It removed the distance between his private reality and public perception. And once that distance disappeared, everything became part of the story. Not just the music, not just the achievements, but the confusion, the contradictions, the moments that didn't make sense. For some, that erased the legacy. For others, it made the story more complicated. Because separating the artist from the person became harder over time. Not because people didn't try, but because there was no clear line left to separate them. And that raises a question that still doesn't have a clear answer. Was Kanye West's story about success? Or was it about what success turns into when it grows too large to control? Because if you look at where it started and where it ended up, the contrast is impossible to ignore. A producer who wanted to be seen, an artist who demanded to be heard, a figure who reshaped culture in his own image, and eventually, someone whose image became impossible to define. In the end, fame didn't destroy him in a simple way. It transformed him into something more complex, something harder to understand, harder to explain, and impossible to reduce to a single narrative. Which means the story doesn't really have a clean ending, only a lasting question. Not about what happened to Kanye West, but about what happens to anyone when the spotlight never turns off.